fine, dreary Boston day after we get teased with springtime, and now here we are again, right? So my name is Luanne E Witkowski. I think most of you in the room know me, and those of you who don't, I am a Boston artist. I identify as a painter and a process and environmentalist. So that's who I am in my art persona. I'm here today to talk to you about what I do in my studio practice and what the results of that are, which is what you're sitting amongst right now. I wrote this thing a few years ago, and someone said to me just today, "Oh, why didn't you put that up during this show?" And you know, I keep this in my studio all the time because I keep referring back to it because this thread runs through all my work. And I'd like to read it to you all now. And it says, I think about and I invite, I think I can do this. Sorry, y'all. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Could you hear me a minute ago? Okay, sorry about that. I forget I have them on, I wear them so much. So I think about and invite you to think about the physical presence of non-objective abstract art, the phenomenon of being, consciousness and sensory perception, the meaning, power, simplicity of line, the relationships of shapes, the content of color. Nature brings us back to a profound simplicity and minimalism. Earth, sky, and sea. In ever-changing relationships of color, shape, and texture. When we look out, our views are monumental and expansive. Vast seas, big skies, columns of clouds, infinite stars. When we look inward, our views are small and intimate. Crawling closed wooded trails, puddle-sized kettle ponds, tidal coves, crowded communities, and cozy interiors. To express the essence of experiencing that language is its own meaning. The sun's smooth warmth on scratchy pummeled sand, the wind's capricious conversation with noble clouds and ominous shadows, white hot snow that burns our eyes with its brightness. So I wrote that in 2016 after many years of thinking about what my work comes from. And my work comes from my experience in the world. So because I'm a process artist and I like to work with many materials, I'm constantly looking and collecting and foraging and saying, oh, I've got to bring that with me. And when I bring all these things into the studio with me, over the years, you know, they're like my friends, but it starts to speak more to me about the experience I had being in those spaces. So I spend a lot of time out in nature, and I love it there. Feels good. You know, I like the dirt under my feet, the grass between my toes, the wind looking at my face, you know, and that whole experience for me is part of my process. I sponge it, I absorb it, and I bring it home to the studio with me. Now, I also happen to live in the center of the city, and I work in the center of the city. And every day I walk through architecture that is sharp and reflective and shiny and glassy and pointed, right? And so I have this juxta experience, right? I have the hard and the sharp and the brash and the loud, and then I have the quiet and the soft and the comforting. And they both go hand in hand for me. And I often pick up things that are the remnants of that city experience too. You know, cast off plexiglass that someone used for a project and only had a small piece left of. That's a hazardous material. I can tell you that. I work as a studio manager at a local area art college. And you know, one of the things we talk about a lot is sustainability and responsible studio practice. So, you know, when I see things like plexiglass that are just discarded, and I know that it's a hazmat, which is hazardous material, it's not supposed to go in the trash. And I'm like, so what do we do with that? What do we creatures that created it do with it when we're done with it? And so I started to look for beauty in the discarded, and to find beauty in the things that we take for granted and walk past every day. And I thought about how that happens in nature too. So for instance, those paintings, I call them paintings, that are on the wall there that have massive chunks of bark in them. That bark is what fell off of massive logs that we just harvested in northwestern Maine on their way to the lumberyard. And as they were rumbling through the road on these massive lumber trucks, they were shedding some of their skin. And as that bark fell to the side of the road and I looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh, no one will see the beauty in this, and those trees are gone from us now. So how can I collect these jewels and bring them back to our attention so we remember how much we love nature and how beautiful she is? And so my work is about that. It's about my experience. It's about my reflection on that experience and helping it to reflect back to all of you. So a lot of the elements, like the plexiglass and the mirrors in my work, are reflective in a different way, right? So they reflect and they capture you in the piece, and I reflect on my experience and the things that I've collected and frankly hoarded until they spoke to me and told me where they belong together. And so because my experience is these two worlds bumping into each other, I have found a way to let these materials speak to me in the studio and bump into each other to tell these stories of the human experience. So I think that was a lot. So I welcome you to ask me a question or two now before we move on to our other artists who are showing in the gallery right now. If anyone has a question, I'm happy to answer it. If you need to just ruminate and reflect on what I said, that's fine too. Yes?
The work in the room here, in which it represents your most recent body of work, feels to me like there's a lot more breath going on and a lot more inside out going on. What I remember of your work up till now, which I've always admired, has brought me from the outside in, and has been more pensive, where I'm feeling something different, something that has been very transitory in experience. And to hear you talk about finding things in northern Maine and the hazmat materials and finding a way to give it breath is curious to me. Are you aware of this? And if so, how are you managing the composite of the individual works?
Wow. Thank you. No, I want to say thank you for that question. It's a really good one. So for instance, this little piece right here is called Walking Meditation. And it was one of the first in this series of work. And, you know, it kind of speaks to what you are asking about, I believe. Because after all the walking and foraging and collecting and all that, I do sit with the materials. I do in a different way than I used to. So in the past, a lot of my work contained like crushed shells from the Wellfleet beaches, where we find the jingle shells, which are like, you know, toenails that fell off people and stuff, right? And I would crush them up and make them into a paint inside of my work. And so, yeah, it was more about the process of the making of the materials, of the usage. And these became more about the process of reflection and, as you said, breathing and opening up. You know, for 3 years we were boxed up in our places because this, you know, pandemic came, and it boxed us up and it took away from us a lot. It took people away from us. It took time together away from us, and it took the three-dimensionality of the world away from us on some levels of sharing. And so, being in my, you know, I couldn't work for a little while during that time because it was just a crazy time. But I found that being in my studio with the materials and just being with them started to comfort me And it helped me to be able to take these walking meditations and have a breakthrough. This piece is the breakthrough piece, and it's named that because that's what happened. All of a sudden, I could see these pieces begin to come together as my experience in the past 3 years. And I let myself play with them and to have that experience and work with them. I've always considered Mother Nature my collaborator, and things like COVID are part of Mother Nature too. And so, I had to let some of that really heavy stuff that we all carried around with us be a part of that letting go too, and opening up and refinding joy in the world through finding the beauty in discarded and overlooked things. Now, I think part of your question was, how do I put them together? Very carefully.
Oh, well.
I'm not sure if you wanted me to talk about the physicality of putting them together, or just that the way that why are these particular things speaking to each other?
What I'm noticing, you in the past have produced, some very impressive work, and the engraving and then the tonality and the color that brings it alive has been very much a part of the whole. And coming off the surface, outside, the inside of the primary real estate of the format certainly was present, but in these, there's like boom going on.
Yeah.
There's this, like the breakthrough is a great example. You break edges all over the place, and it's full of light, and it's full of reflection, and it's full of breath, and so I'm feeling that a lot more, and I'm wondering if, and I think you've answered it, I think, already with regard to what the pandemic did.
Yeah.
And forcing us to take bigger, deeper, longer breaths.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just
I'm
a
so
thought.
glad that you see all that.
Yeah.
And I have to say that, for the first time in my work, the light cast by the different colors here and reflections and shadows are an actual part of the work.
Mm-hmm.
So the work does not end here. The work extends,
Correct.
right? And even, although you can't see now because everybody's feet are on it, but even over there on the floor, there's a little spot of green, and there's a little spot of green there. So these things are playing with each other, and they're casting themselves beyond their edges, which is really exciting for me. This show was an exciting body of work for me to put